Hello, this is Paramjeet Singh from Passing Clouds, series of conversation, coaching, thoughts, ideas, and meanderings. So, if you are a person of Indian origin, South Asian origin, um, or a physician, a healthcare provider, this may be a piece of information you would like for your own personal consumption and for your professional efficiency. So recently, a paper was published in the Journal of Endocrinology, Diabetes and Metabolism in 2022, highlighting or outlining the case if the rising or already risen cases of cardiometabolic disorders, which includes high blood pressure and the cases of diabetes too among population, can be traced to the colonial rules of 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And one of the arguments laid out in that paper is that since during that time, a lot of South Asian people were exposed to severe famines, lack of food and resources, the body went into a different transformational process to cope with that adversity, and usually that shows up in the mutated or the altered gene structure of the people, which comes into play through what the to a specific process or specific discipline called epigenetics, where the genes are expressed throughout the generations. So what they laid out that between 18th century and 20th century, during around 190 years of the colonial rule over India, Indian population experienced 31 major famines. And what is more interesting and devastatingly revelatory about this is that in 190 years, 31 major famines happened or occurred in India. However, in the previous 2000 years, only around 13 famines were were reported. So if you see, and it's possible that there were more famine, but only recorded has been found to be 13 famine. And what a famine does to the human body is that when you are under a severe stress of shortage of food, the body goes to a very different phase. It has to survive and continues to remain in that survival mode. And that survival mode began to change the way genes act and express itself. And the argument is that that led to what we call the starvation adaptation issues, that the body became adapted to the continuous starvation that happened during famines. And then fast forward a few hundred years, and when India got the independence, and slowly the thing starts to change, and even though there's a massive inequality still in that place, people had more or relatively more access to abundance of the food. So now your body has been adapted for the past 200 years to work in a survival mode, to work without much nutrition and food, and suddenly you are now have all those abundance of the food. And now imagine what is going to happen, how the body is going to react. And this is one of the reason, or this is one of the reason laid out in that paper, that we, especially Indian folks, if you see, they have a big midsection, abdominal fat, and there's a asymmetry between how the fat is accumulated. And usually those asymmetries are because when you are running out of resources, the abdominal fat would be likely consumed during those moments of starvation or famines. But since we have now all the abundance of the food, especially if you live in the West, or if you are in a street in a strata of society which have access to abundance of the food, you are running on an old genetic train, but you are working through a new system of food availability, and those two mixes don't work very well. So it surprises me when you go here, for example, in Toronto or Surrey area, where people lining up in the front of all the sweet shops, and you wonder, that it is not, our human body is not designed for that. You are not supposed to be gurgling down or horking down all this kind of the food with the abundance of calories and fat and all sort of things. Now I want to say fat is not the enemy here, but I'm talking in a particular context here, especially when your body is adapted to the severity or the shortage of the food, and suddenly you have access to all the chole bhatures and everything which you can take out, call in, or be delivered. And that creates a kind of an interesting unhealthy mix. So the rise of cardiometabolic disorders among Indian populations may be related to a combination of factors. It could be related to the famines, the shortage of the food that occurred during the colonial rule in 200 years. But then, because our body has adapted to continuously stay in the survival mode, it now actually act differently when it is fed with all those abundance of the food. So moving forward, if this is something you would like to bring into your home as a way of intervention so that you can prevent some of these things happening, is to realize that some of the food we eat today, or especially overeat today, may not be good for our body because our body has adapted to very different circumstances. Second, we also have to recognize that food is not the only problem here. A lot of people who immigrate, they go through what we call immigration stress. It is a stress of dislocation, assimilation into new culture, finding your feet, trying to figure out the way to survive in a different kind of society and fit into the different culture. So a combination of these factors, this genetic predisposition, and combined with perceived distress, cultural dislocation, and availability, abundance of the food, especially calorie rich, unhealthy food, all these things create a kind of a mix, create a scenario which doesn't bode well for South Asian population. So I think if you want to move forward as a way to stem this rising tide of cardiometabolic disorders, of high blood pressure and diabetes and all other related problems, we have to think of this problem in a variety of ways. No, it's helpful to know that colonial rule may have caused that genetic shift in South Asian bodies, but it is also worth pointing out that we need to eliminate or at least dramatically alter all other factors which becomes problematic when they meet the predisposition and create all these kind of problems. So moving forward, if you are a physician, you can think of these things, that the colonial rule may be one of the issues in this whole process, but it's still, by laying the blame in colonial rule, we cannot somehow get away from the fact that the way we engage with the food is actually unhealthy. If you want to see how people consume stuff, you can visit in major immigrant centers, or focal points like in Toronto, Brampton, or other areas across Canada, and see how people in fact line up around those sweet shops. To me, that's surprising, since we have a rising problems among our community. So this is I want to share with you. So there's a indication that a colonial rule may have led to predisposition for South Asian population. That's why they have this higher tendency to have blood pressure and risk factor for diabetes. And that should be taken into account, because that means that's a factor which is not in your control. But you can utilize this information to change our behavior, the way we consume food. That's what we can control. And maybe we can focus more on the quantity of the food we take in. That's also important. It's not what you eat, it's also how much you eat and when you eat, and all sort of things actually play into creating the body you live in, the habitat you live in. So if this finds you intriguing you, and if this makes you think about things, take a moment to share with other people, especially in the community, and ask them to, if they can at least start to think about relating to the consumption differently so that we can create a healthy society in the long term. Medication is helpful under circumstances, but medication is not the only thing we should rely upon. We should lay out the reasoning, what is happening, and then we can eliminate some of the circumstances which makes things worse. And I think the food and the way we eat it, the quantity we eat, are all those factors which makes things worse. That's it for today. Thank you very much for stopping by. If you find this conversation useful, please drop a like, make a comment, and subscribe to our channel and share with your friends. I would really appreciate. And I will see you next time. In the meantime, stay curious and reasonably non-judgmental. Bye bye for now.
Please subscribe to the channel, like and share. Thank you.